Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to explain the essence of pragmatism in three different key quotes from various pragmatist thinkers, that being Charles Peirce, John Dewey, and Hilary Putnam. And this is taking place over the course of about 100 years. So a significant amount has changed throughout these different quotes, but I think that they provide some of what it really means to be a pragmatist in terms of the way in which one approaches problems, ideas, the world, etc. I think that these are very important ways for understanding how pragmatists reshape the history of philosophy and reshape what philosophy is supposed to be doing. First, we have the famous pragmatic axiom from Charles Peirce's How to Make Our Ideas Clear. And this shows the first thing that pragmatism seeks to do, which is to avoid superfluous problems. He takes someone like Descartes, for example, who is in a state of epistemological angst. He needs to figure out what is his firm foundation for knowledge, and he needs to find something that is unquestionable, that is the ground of what knowledge can be sure and what knowledge cannot be sure. And he wants pure surety. This is the hope of philosophy, at least. As a result, Descartes says, well, if something can be doubted, I'm going to doubt it, and I'm going to find that thing I cannot doubt, which is that I am a thinking thing, and thus the foundation for what makes me me, what makes epistemology certain, is me and the certainty of my thinking. Now, Descartes uses this to create a number of problems, such as, for example, the subject-object split, because knowledge starts from the cogito, from the thinking thing who creates the knowledge, right? Because all knowledge is mediated by the cogito. So no matter what the world is beyond the cogito is ultimately that thing that is barring us from having an objective view of the world. Thus, we get the beginning of the subject-object split, and this is going to be one of the big things that pragmatist philosophers will go against. As such, Peirce wants to get past a lot of these false problems. For example, the mind-body problem is the kind of thing that a pragmatist is not going to have time for, because this is a superfluous problem that only exists in a hyper-specific discourse that makes it into a problem. And the pragmatists want to point out that a lot of problems aren't inherent. They're created out of a certain historical moment, a sort of discourse that creates it. And we want to reorganize philosophy not to be concerned with the ideas created by philosophers, but rather those which we are compelled to interrogate by the world of experience. Thus, the pragmatic world of tarrying with things in our experience is going to ground philosophical reflection, leading Peirce to say, consider what effect that might conceivably have practical bearing we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. And this does a number of important things. It narrows what our philosophical objects are going to be. Namely, does it have some kind of effect outside of philosophy? Does it do something? And this is not a utilitarian argument, but rather this is saying that, okay, for example, Peirce uses the example of the transubstantiation. Now, the Catholics believe that when the priest does all of the rites to the sacraments, the wine turns into the actual blood of Jesus Christ and the bread into his body. Now, the Protestants believe that this is just a metaphor of sorts, that it doesn't actually transubstantiate bodily. It is a spiritual transubstantiation. Now, Peirce says, look, these two Christians can argue back and forth about this, and they can get into these really heated arguments. But what are the practical effects of believing either one? Well, either way, you still take the sacrament. You still go about your life feeling that you're saved, for example, and feeling that you have the grace of God behind you. So Peirce says, what is the point of bickering over this if the difference cannot make a difference? If it cannot be reflected in experience, then it may just be that we are making up a problem that in fact is keeping us from interacting with the world. Because that's what the pragmatist wants to do, wants to see philosophy, like everything else, as a tool for tarrying. A tool for successfully coping with one's goals and desires and beliefs. And ultimately, what we're trying to do with philosophy is make our ideas clear. And our ideas, if they are to mean anything, they ought to have some sort of practical import. And thus, that is the grounding foundation of pragmatism laid out from the beginning in Peirce. Now, John Dewey comes on the scene in 1917 and totally changes the way that we think about knowledge and what we're doing in everyday experience. In his essay from 1917, The Need for a Recovery of Philosophy, he asks, what is experience? What is it constituted by? What does it entail for what we are as thinking beings and tarrying beings? And he says that actually most of our experience is not philosophical at all. It's not cognitive or knowledge-based. It's merely a matter of habits that we use, which are informed by our beliefs, which we use to interact with the world. And he gives us an example. He says, suppose it is a question of water, and we're thinking about what it means to know water, or what it means to interact with water. The thing to be known does not present itself primarily as a matter of knowledge and ignorance at all. So contrary to the normal philosophical assumption, most of the times when we interact with things, we're not interacting with it for the sake of knowledge or for the sake of ignorance. Instead, it occurs as a stimulus to action and as the source of certain undergoings. It is something to react to drink, to wash with, to put out fire with, and also something that reacts unexpectedly to our reactions, that makes us undergo disease, suffocation, drowning. In this twofold way, water or anything else enters into experience. Notice that experience as such is value-laden. It has to do with, as Heidegger would say, our for the sake of which, our calling, what our station in life is. Such presence in experience has of itself nothing to do with knowledge or consciousness, nothing that is in the sense of depending upon them, although it has everything to do with knowledge and consciousness in the sense that the latter depends upon prior experience of this non-cognitive sort. What Dewey is saying is that our knowledge that we have philosophically, knowledge here is a formal designation of a category. Specifically, those things which we understand logically and through a coherent framework that we have cognized. Meaning that we're no longer just operating off of instincts, but we've actually taken this idea into the realm of, let me think things out and give it very definite limitations. Let me delimit it, right? But in fact, this knowledge is dependent upon a prior non-cognitive experience, which is to say, the way that I experience the world most of the time has nothing to do with me actively cognizing every element and, knowing exactly what it is beforehand. No, it's just a series of habitual reaction to the world. It's a sort of on the nose, on the button reaction that doesn't depend on formal knowledge. It just depends on a sort of fundamental attunedness, Stimmung, as Heidegger would say. Man's experience is what it is because his response to things, even successful response, and the reactions of things to his life are so radically different from knowledge. In other words, the reason that experience is what it is because it's not primarily a knowledge affair. It's a habit affair. It's a tarrying affair, a living affair. Thus, knowledge and living are to some extent opposed to one another, insofar as living is habitual. whereas knowledge is something formal and abstracted away from the habitual so that we can sit down and reason things, right? So that we can actively check all of our terms and make sure that we've got everything squared out. But that's not how most of our life is, even for philosophers. As such, he writes, the difficulties and tragedies of life, the stimuli to acquiring knowledge, lie in the radical disparity of presence in experience and presence in knowing. Now, these are two important categories that are going to really set the foundations for what it means to be a person as a pragmatist. Namely, you have two different ways of being in the world, so to speak. One is that things are present in experience in a non-cognitive, or rather a pre-cognitive way. In other words, it has nothing to do with me making a mental representation, as, for example, people like Descartes or Locke would say, with this spectator theory of knowledge, where I have just kind of non-clothed sensory stimuli coming to me, and these have a bunch of primary qualities, and my brain imposes secondary qualities like color, for example, because there's nothing inherent about this book that makes it have color. My eyes give it that color, right? Because certain wavelengths interact with my eyes, and that becomes the phenomenological experience of color. So, you have that bare conceptual stimuli coming from experience, and then my mind creates a representation, and that representation is the foundation of what I experience phenomenologically. No. Dewey says, in fact, a precognitive experience, which has nothing to do with knowledge, but rather has to do with practical tarrying. That is the foundation of any formal conception of knowledge, which would be presence in knowing. Last, we have Hilary Putnam writing in Realism with the Human Face in 1987. And by now, we've achieved another kind of articulation stemming from the rejection of the subject-object split, which is the separation of the scheme and content duality. Now, this says that, for example, we have the content of the world here, and we have a conceptual scheme of some kind over here used to talk about that content in order to cognize that content. This could be, for example, a linguistic system. It could be a system of doctrine, like a religious doctrine. It could be a number of mathematical or physics axioms. This is the sort of stuff that acts as the architecture by which we can schematize and thus cognize the content of the world. Now, because of what Dewey has said, people like Donald Davidson have really emphasized the fact that we cannot separate the world, which is the content, from the scheme used to talk about the world. Because Dewey has mentioned that, for example, the notion of an object or a world is a formal category. It's something we take from a number of disparate elements and we create it into a coherent scheme, which we call a world. And in our world, we can talk about certain objects. It makes sense to talk about books or water bottles or doors. It doesn't make sense to talk about kerfluffles because we don't have, what is a kerfluffle? We don't have a concept of an object that might match to that word. Thus, we have a relationship to the way we can interact with the world, with the concepts that we have to articulate that world. But Putnam is going to stress, and this is one of the important strands in contemporary pragmatism, is that this does not make us relativists. Because to be a relativist would say that we have some objective world over here. A capital W world of capital T truths. And then over here, we have one perspective. Maybe here we have another, and here we have another. And they all have different ways of schematizing that world. Thus, the difference in knowledge we have, and the reason that it's relative, is that it's relative to the observer talking about a given world. But Putnam realizes that, for example, in the beginning of this essay, he talks about how we have rejected this in physics today with the notion of quantum mechanics. Because in quantum mechanics, when we observe a quantum particle, we cause the wave function to collapse because of the interaction, which is observation, because we figured out that actually observation is a form of perturbation, and it is going to have an effect on the system we are observing. Thus, to talk about the world independent of observation and thus independent of the perturbations of subjective experience is impossible. We can't do that. It's like asking, I think Donald Davidson said this, it's like being asked to rearrange a closet, but rearrange the closet in and of itself. Don't rearrange the particular shoes and clothes inside it. No, rearrange the closet itself. That doesn't even make sense. How do you even do that? It's not in itself. It's a bunch of little elements. So Putnam says that, okay, quantum mechanics is one of the ways that we've shown that, for example, the world and the way that we talk about and articulate the world are inextricably linked. And as such, we are not relativists insofar as there is not one common world, because we cannot speak of some total world. We don't have an epistemological God's eye point of view from which to talk about that. As such, Putnam writes, what I'm saying then is that elements of what we call language or mind penetrate so deeply into what we call reality that the very project of representing ourselves as being the mappers of something languages independent is fatally compromised from the very start. Like relativism, but in a different way, realism is an impossible attempt to view the world from nowhere with a capital N, right? This is some fully grounded, objective position that is not going to have an effect on what we're observing. In this situation, it is a temptation to say, so we make the world, or our language makes up the world, or our culture makes up the world. But this is just another form of the same mistake. If we succumb once again, we view the world, the only world we know, as a product. One kind of philosopher views it as a product from a raw material, namely unconceptualized reality. The other views it as a creation ex nihilo. But the world isn't a product, it's just a world. This is a pragmatist statement par excellence. We have a world which is just a brute fact that we experience. This is something the phenomenologists stress too. Okay, it is just an objective fact that I experience things phenomenologically. And I can talk about my phenomenological experience without needing mediation, because phenomenological experience needs no mediation. It is directly kind of congruous with the self. In the same way, the world is not a product that we stand ahead of or before and construct it and then it comes in front of us. No, the world is just there. And if we want to talk about it, we can't say, well, our language makes up the world, because that makes it sound like the world is an ad hoc construction that we stood before. No, we are always synchronous with and equiprimordial with our world. As such, these three different quotes prove how pragmatism works, the kind of ways that it is going to be approaching knowledge, experience in the world, and I hope that this helps a little bit. That being said, that's it for this video. I hope it's been helpful. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I'd appreciate anything you have to give. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.